Hey guys, I'm back. Well, I was gone for a little bit. I actually went down to Florida to see some of my family, which Florida's rad, by the way. It was a really good time. But I missed you guys. So, um, let's pick up where we left off. Jonah chapter 3. So, Jonah chapter 3 basically happened right after Jonah got spit out from the giant fish and got shot on the shore. So, it says, P.S. If you hear a bunch of noise in the background, it's just Moose. He's making so much noise and trying to break stuff. So that's Moose. That's what he does. So, when the Lord spoke to Jonah a second time, see, God never gives up. God will always keep coming. Get up, go to the great city of Nineveh, and deliver the message of judgment that I have given you. I'm actually going to use also some of my notes. I taught Jonah to a bunch of high schoolers, almost 10 years ago. And I like some of the notes that I put in here, so you might see me reference this piece of paper after a while. But I really appreciate that God makes his plan plain and simple, especially to Jonah. Like, he made his intentions plain and simple. You're either going to obey me and go to Nineveh and preach the message that I'm telling you to preach, or you're going to die. That's kind of where we're at. Like, there's either do or die with God. I mean, of course, we serve a God that gives us many opportunities and is very forgiving, but there's right and wrong. There's black and white. The wages of sin is death. The wages of God is life. He's a pretty black and white God. This time, that's the key phrase. This time. God's all about time. This time Jonah obeyed the Lord's commandment and went to Nineveh, a city so large it took 3 days to see it all. I never really understood how big that was until my mother explained to me that Disneyland was so big it would take 3 days to see everything. Now, granted, that was back when I was younger, but I always thought that was like, whoa, it takes 3 days to see all the things inside of it. That's how I thought about that. I just thought that was kind of interesting. Um, on the day Jonah entered the city, he shouted to the crowds. So Jonah didn't waste no time. He walked through those gates, and on that exact day that he entered, he started shouting and proclaiming and preaching what God told him to say. Now, let's backtrack for a sec. These people are bad people. The Assyrians kill people. They walk around with people's heads on sticks. Okay? They murder you for just looking at someone cross-eyed. They are vicious, awful people. I mean, I don't actually have physical, factual examples, but if you just Google what the Assyrians were like in Jonah's time, it's horrific what these people used to do. It's kind of like Vikings. I don't know if that's actually the same, but it's the same concept as kind of how the Vikings were. They were pretty ruthless. Or could be. The people of Nineveh believed God's message from the greatest to the least. Think about that. The unwavering listening. This strange man, comes into their town and starts preaching that God's going to proclaim all this judgment upon them for all their actions and all their sins. And these people, vicious people, just listen to him. That's called the power of God. That is hands down the power of God. That these people didn't just turn and go, this guy's annoying, kill him. Think about that. Because they could have easily just turned around and shot a spear probably through Jonah and ended it. Not when God's the forefront and the center and your perspective is on God. When you have a God perspective, everything else looks different to you. When you're up here in your perspective at God's level of seeing the big picture, everything changes. So they decided to go without food and wear sackcloth to show their sorrow. Which back then, if you dressed in sackcloth and put ashes on your head, that was a sense of mourning. That was basically a sacrifice or a symbol of repentance or somber. Somber is probably the right word. When the king of Nineveh, so the king, the head guy, head bad guy, heard what Jonah was saying, he stepped down from his throne and took off his royal robes. That's a big deal. I can't stress enough whenever I've taught chapter 3 of Jonah how big of a deal it is that the king of Nineveh stepped down off of his throne when seeing and hearing what Jonah was doing and saying, and took off his royal robes and wore a sackcloth and ashes on his head. I mean, this is a man that controlled an entire territory. You know, when you watch like The Emperor's New Groove, I don't know why I'm having all these Disney references, but I think it's because I was around my nephews. But um when you like watch The Emperor's New Groove or one of those like Disney movies, when the king does something, that's a big deal. It affects the entire region. And so for him to step down out of his worldly appearance, out of his, royalty, I guess, and become less than himself, become dirty, become somber, that is very significant that the king recognized God because he recognized what Jonah was saying was from God. So you never know how God's going to use you. You never know what God's going to do with your story, your life, the time and place that you are in, and who that's going to move. He moved an entire country, an entire people group with this. Now, granted, the story doesn't end very good for Nineveh later on throughout the Bible. However, in this particular section of verses, this was a very good opportunity for them to obey. That's just my favorite part, so I love to emphasize that part. He dressed himself in a sackcloth and sat on a heap of ashes. Well, there you go. Then the king and his nobles, so all of his cabinet, kind of like, how the president would be, all of his admin and all his people, sent a decree throughout the whole city. No one, not even the animals, may eat or drink anything at all. Okay, well, that sucks. That sounds sucky. But what that means is they're fasting. Basically, it's a fasting and praying and being repentant to God. Everyone is required to wear a sackcloth and pray earnestly to God. There you go. Everyone must turn from their evil ways and stop all the violence. Hey, Jonah, that's a big deal. You're a big deal right now. But you're only a big deal, Jonah, because of God. See, Jonah's going to have to learn that. He's only a big deal because of God. This has absolutely nothing to do with Jonah. This has everything to do with God. That's our lives. We are small and God is big. We are made big because God's big. That's it. Because we are actually very small, insignificant things. We're really only on the earth, if we're lucky, my Gigi lived to be 100 years old. Okay, that's like remarkable. But really, what is 100 years to God? It's but a vapor. I mean, think about all the people in history that have lived 100 years and we don't even know some of their names. It's true. Think about all the people in history. Every human being. We don't know every human being. We know the famous ones. But just think about that. But all of these lives are significant to God. Jonah's life is significant. And we read about him here, and he's famous to God. But everybody's famous to God. All of these Ninevites matter to God. This king matters to God. I want that kingdom perspective. I want that God perspective. Because every person you're going to encounter today, every person you've encountered before today or before watching this message, they matter to God. I'm guilty of this too. There are people that annoy me that I cannot describe to another human being how they drive me bonkers. But they still matter to God. So therefore, if God is within me and God is for me and I am a child of God, then that person needs to matter to me too. I don't know if that just made sense in a roundabout way, but when you're made big because of God, then everyone else around you matters more. Everything else around you matters more. And I don't mean like every situation and all the drama and all that stuff, but I'm just saying you have a different way of looking at it that makes it matter in a different way. I don't know if that made sense, but I think you guys are tracking with me. I think you guys know where I'm going with that. So, everyone must turn from their evil ways and stop all their violence. Who can tell? Perhaps yet even God. Oh, perhaps even yet God, my bad, will have pity on us and hold back his fierce anger from destroying us. I like that. Who can tell? Who knows? Who has any idea? But perhaps even yet, God will have pity on us and hold back his fierce anger from destroying us. You know, it's interesting how the people of Nineveh, even though ultimately later in the Bible they are destroyed, it's still, they're not unaware of God. That's the very dangerous thing. Like, I'm going to get real for a minute. I live in a part of the world that is probably one of the most unchurched parts of the United States. But people in this part of the country are not unaware of God. They just choose to disobey God. They choose to run away from God. Yes, there are some people that, of course, haven't heard the gospel yet or haven't encountered God yet. There's a difference between hearing something and encountering something. Very different. But that's a whole other message. But what I'm saying is this part of the country, they are choosing to actively go against the grain in right and wrong. And I always like to say I'm a rebel for God because, you know, I think there are some rebellious things about God in society because society says something should be one way and God's like, no, I'm not doing it that way. I don't think like you do. So I think that word rebellious in the Bible has a purpose and I think it has a very distinct purpose. But what I'm talking about is people that actively choose to turn their backs on God and walk away and say, I'm not going to do that. It doesn't fit my narrative. It doesn't fit what I want. Because God is not an I want God. God is, this is the way it is. That's my will, my power, and I'm in control. There is right and wrong. And the last verse, I love this. It says, when God saw that they had put a stop to their evil ways, he had mercy on them and didn't carry out the destruction that he had threatened. Think about if people put away their evil ways and destruction that they were causing and the debauchery and all that stuff, what God would do in return if it was turned towards him. What God would do for this country. What God would do for this land. It's a very serious message for a moment. Just think about that. And don't ever think you're not significant enough to make a difference. Look at Jonah. Jonah's life made a difference. Even though ultimately later on Nineveh made a different choice, that doesn't take away from what he did here. There's a song that Martina McBride sings called Anyway. And throughout it, it's like pray it anyway, love anyway, you know, and it goes on down. Do it anyway. Like, even though ultimately Nineveh in the end is destroyed, which is later on throughout different chapters in the Bible, in Jonah, Jonah didn't do any of this in vain. He didn't. But it's all about what is motivating him. In this chapter, God is motivating Jonah. So in chapter 4, we're going to see what flips for Jonah. But I guess that's what I want you guys to really think about in this message is what is motivating you to do the things that you do? What has, you know, I say this a lot, what brought you here? You know, we have a decision, we are significant. You have an impact. And like I talked about, you know, from the greatest to the least, You are small, God is big, but that doesn't mean you being small has any less significance than this greatness up here. God sees you. God sees you, and He wants to make you great and big if you'll just turn and look up at Him. I hope you guys have the best week. I miss doing this with you guys. Have the best day. Bye.